Has a quorum call be dispensed with?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to thank my colleagues for passing America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 and the importance of it to the state of Washington. This legislation is going now to the President's desk, and it's very needed to help make our ports more competitive, protect thousands of jobs, and help protect our salmon habitat in the state of Washington. This legislation means that the ports of Seattle and Tacoma will be able to deepen their harbors and meet the much larger cargo demands that we have to if we're going to compete with other ports on the West Coast, specifically in Canada. This legislation also improves the critical habitat for salmon in waterways like the Puget Sound and Columbia River, and it also helps utilities make common sense investments for the future and helps protect our ratepayers and the environment. So I'm proud to have worked on this legislation with our colleagues because we need to keep moving forward on investments that help make our region competitive. Our ports are essential to our economic growth in the Northwest. I always say ports are us because we have so many along the Columbia River and on the West Coast. And trade is a cornerstone of our economy with $94 billion in exports and $91 billion in imports each year. So the fact that this legislation helps us on important maintenance and operations for both large and small ports, for locks and dams and waterways, is so important to our future. It also helps us with important alliance that Seattle and Tacoma did together to help our marine cargo operations at the port, which generate $4.3 billion in economic activity, and 48,000 jobs are dependent upon. What happened is as the world market changed and large container ships could double in size the amount of product they were shipping, it was so important for our West Coast ports to be competitive and able to serve these large Panamax ships. These mega ships, which are twice the length of the Space Needle, wider than a football field, carry twice the number of containers compared to ships that typically call on West Coast ports. They needed deeper waterways. To maintain a top-grade lane through the Pacific Northwest and to compete with the Canadian ports, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma have to deepen their ports and make the navigational changes to address the large container ships. So the Army Corps and the Northwest Seaport Alliance teamed up with Seattle Harbor Navigational Improvement Study, Tacoma Navigational Study Improvement, and many other partners to make sure we were making the right investments. So in this legislation, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are big economic winners. They're economic winners because we are authorizing over $29 million to deepen the east and west waterways at the Port of Seattle to 57 feet, and when the project is completed, the Port of Seattle will be the deepest in the country. It will allow us to serve those Panamax ships, and instead of having just 1,000 or 12,000 cargo containers, it will be up to 18,000 cargo containers. And the same, we're expecting to complete a feasibility study at the Port of Tacoma, where it is expected to be deepened, which is currently at 51 feet. So these two projects are going to help us continue to build the reputation of the ports of Seattle and Tacoma as moving our products throughout the United States to Asia quickly and reliably and reaching critical markets. We don't want our shippers to have to pay more because we haven't made these infrastructure investments. Moving freight is what we do, and we've made improvements in our physical land transportation infrastructure. This bill is about making it in our waterways as well. Deepening the waterways of ports at Seattle and Tacoma will ensure that they can compete with Canadian ports. It will help us continue to grow our job in the maritime sector, and it will help us continue to be a gateway from North America to Asia. This legislation also, though, helps us in restoring waters adjacent to Puget Sound and helping us with our salmon recovery efforts. For the last 18 years, Puget Sound Adjacent Waters Program has focused on protecting and restoring habitat within the Puget Sound Basin. So using this program, the Army Corps was able to work with places like the city of Burien to remove a seawall on the Seahurst Park shoreline. Now that shoreline is a habitat for endangered salmon and home to bald eagles and osprey and attracting visitors everywhere. The Army Corps also was able to use the program to help on the Tulalip Reservation to restore critical habitat along the Snohomish River that was lost in the early 20th century. The estuary now provides access to spawning and rearing and feeding areas for salmon. And Puget Sound, the second largest estuary in the United States, is home to thousands of species that also this will help. Over a dozen of these species are listed as endangered or threatened, and us helping by making these improvements to clean up Puget Sound and restore habitat is so important to the viability of the Pacific Northwest. The bill increases funding for Puget Sound adjacent water restoration from $40 million to $60 million, and the per project funding from 5 to 10. These are just expanded numbers, but they mean everything from meeting the goals of these projects around Puget Sound. We are returning our waterways to Puget Sound unblocked and providing cleaner habitat for salmon, for threatened juvenile salmon, and opportunities in areas like Spencer Island in the Snohomish River estuary near Everett, Washington. Another project will restore tidal flows and create open coastline inlets at the creek originating near Joint Base Lewis McChord, south of Puget Sound. So in this will help us restore spawning habitats, help us for forage fish and support salmon recovery, and improve those shoreline conditions that are so important. So these projects are just an example of the diversity that our region uses when it tries to help our ecosystem known as Puget Sound and helping salmon recovery. This legislation also helps in making sure that those who make great improvements to our water infrastructure, particularly our hydro system, get rewarded for doing that, and that they don't wait and hesitate to get that done. This legislation provides an early action provision for licensees on hydro systems to make improvements and make sure that they will be recognized later. This provision would remove an impediment, and it encourages people to take corrective action sooner than later. That is good for our environment, it's good for taxpayers, and it helps us save on energy. Most importantly, it does not take away, though, any regulatory oversight but the agency, but simply rewarding people earlier for doing the right thing. I know that Chelan PUD is a good example of this and will take advantage of this as they plan to rehabilitate units at Rock Island Hydro Project, a significant investment of over $500 million. This area needs to have these upgrades, and this provision will help them get it done sooner. We also, in this legislation, are helping to fight one of the most challenging things we see in our waterways, and that is protecting the physical infrastructure and waterways in our hydro system from invasive species. The highly invasive quagga and zebra mussels have invaded our waterways in 20 different states. If invasive mussel populations invade the Pacific Northwest, it is estimated that it could cost our region over $500 million in annual costs. That would be devoting way more of our resources just to manage that infestation. The Columbia Basin is the last major uninfected watershed in the United States, much of it to the credit of watercraft inspections stationed on the Columbia River. The Columbia River Inspection Station helps inspect these boats that travel up and down the river for such invasive species, and they require it's a required inspection on all state watercraft. So I'm pleased that this bill authorizes money specifically for the Columbia River inspection stations. This helps us because, as I said, as a river that hasn't seen these invasive species, the fact that we can still do these inspections is critical. Last year, over 9,000 boats were inspected throughout Washington, and the funding for the Columbia River was successfully kept, and these invasive species were kept out. And that means they were kept out not just in Washington, but in other parts of the Pacific Northwest as well. This legislation also continues the great down payment on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which was created and has helped our state in millions of dollars of annual grants. This is so important, and many of our colleagues know that this drinking water revolving fund, as we saw so many problems in Flint, Michigan, and other places, is necessary for us to keep clean water in the United States. These funds helped the city of Linden replace its 1926 surface treatment water plant and enabled water supply to the Linden community and surrounding area. The funds also have helped the city of Prosser make investments in an aging water system to assure communities have access to clean supply. And at the end of this week, the city of Kelso will be celebrating the completion of the Minor Road Reservoir, which replaced 2 aging reservoirs that were leaking that would have failed in the event of a natural disaster in the area. So the city was able to complete the project with the help of the Drinking Water State Fund. And I'm so glad that that is going to help secure more resources for that part of our state. This also provides states and communities with additional financial resources to make investments in their economies for the future, and it also helps to right wrongs from the past. I'm pleased the bill also delivers on an 80-year-old promise by the Army Corps to complete tribal village development for 4 tribes that were displaced when the dams of the Columbia River were constructed. The Yakima, the Nez Perce, the Umatilla, and Warm Springs all signed treaties with the federal government in the 1850s, and these treaties reserved for the rights of the tribes to fish and hunt and gather at all of those accustomed places. But the Army Corps and treaty rights entered into agreements about the fishing access. The sites were designed for day-to-day fishing, but out of a need, they also were supposed to include housing. This has resulted in very challenging living conditions along the river, so I'm so glad that my colleague, Senator Murray, and my colleagues from Oregon, Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden, that we have been able to make it crystal clear to the Army Corps of Engineers we need to correct this problem. This bill ensures those families will get what they were promised years ago. So, Mr. President, in closing, I want to thank our colleagues, Senator Barrasso and Senator Carper, as well as the leadership of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for all the hard work on this bipartisan legislation. Infrastructure investment when it comes to our waterways means jobs. It means the continued protection of clean water, and for us in the Northwest, helping us preserve our salmon population. I'm so happy that we have finally taken another step towards the competitiveness of our ports in the Northwest. These are real jobs. We'll now be able to serve in the future, near future, with this deepening, larger cargo container ships that will help us keep our competitiveness in moving product. And while we move about 10 billion products of Washington, we move about 7 times more of that from all states of the United States moving through our ports. So while it sounds like an investment in 2 very large port infrastructures on the West Coast, I guarantee you it affects many Midwestern states and many products in their ability to cost-effectively ship to other parts of the world. So I thank the President, and I yield the floor.